Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
Hello, I'm back here again with Olaf and Robert. We are going to be discussing two shows today, both of which we talked about before, but it's always interesting to look at the shows a few months after they've left and revisit them. So we're going to be talking about The Rink, which played at the Southwark Playhouse, which isn't in Southwark, and we're going to be talking about Little Shop of Horrors, which played at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, but again, it's always good to get Robert and Alf's opinions. Let's start with Little Shop of Horrors because it's the more recent show. You've heard my review possibly in a previous episode. My thoughts are I really, really loved it. I thought it worked as a piece. Even if you get a bad production of Little Shop of Horrors, it's still a good show, isn't it?
I completely agree with that. I've seen a very bad production of it in Germany, so I can attest to the fact that it works under the most adverse of circumstances, but it is a incredibly funny and very, very energetically performed at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. I'm still not entirely convinced that the show works on that stage. It makes sense to have a show about a murderous plant in a park, but I don't think it works as well as a couple of years ago Regent's Park Open Air Theatre's production of Into the Woods, which was absolutely magical.
I think one of the problems was, and in fact that you see that if you do compare it with Into the Woods, one of the problems was that in Little Shop of Horrors they kept moving around those kind of wooden blocks which were meant to represent skyscrapers in New York. And I thought the number of times that those blocks had to be moved around was enormously distracting. And I think if they just stuck with a multi-purpose set, as in Into the Woods, where you just had the whole structure there on stage, it might have been better. I think obviously what does have to move are the doors for the plant. For Audrey too. But I thought everything else was a little distracting and they didn't really need it.
It reminded me of the ragtime set that they had. Do you remember with the America thing at the back?
I didn't see Ragtime. I'd seen too many productions of Ragtime when that one came along. And I'm not a big fan of Ragtime anyway. But I thought what was fantastic was the cast. Mm-hmm. It was beautifully sung, especially by Mark Antolin as Seymour. Jemima Roper doesn't have the biggest belt, but she was very affecting.
She's very sweet.
She's very sweet, exactly.
And it's such a hard role to do because everyone has an image of that role. Yes. And I like the fact they gave her pink hair, which was kind of cute. But the piece, I liked it because it did stuff that I've only seen a couple of productions of Little Shop of Horrors, and it just did things differently. Like the chorus girls weren't of the 60s. They were kind of modern, and because we interviewed the three girls before the show, and they said it really does have a timeless feel. Do you think that's a flaw with the fact that the music is so rooted in 50s and 60s pastiche?
Well, the music is pastiche to a certain extent, but it's kind of postmodern pastiche in that it mixes things up. Because you yourself pointed out to me a while ago that there's kind of hip hop or rap at one moment in the score, and I think it's not a careful pastiche of the 50s. It's a playful pastiche.
And also, is it 50s, is it 60s? We don't quite know.
But also after, it might have been different in the early 1980s when it first appeared off Broadway, but now it's, nearly 40 years since it opened, or 35 years since it opened, and the 60s are 60 years or 50 years away. And so we watch pastiche of a particular kind of music with slightly different eyes in the modern times that we're living in now.
Because the 60s has been recycled many times, and so has the 50s. And so yet another recycling in the 80s, which is now being recycled again today. I think that doesn't bother us, the accuracy of the pastiche.
Like it happened a lot in the 80s, because I'm looking at horror movies of the 80s, like Little Shop of Horrors, for example, but also things like Killer Clowns from Outer Space and It. They all went back to the 1950s B movies. So was the 80s a time for looking back to the 50s with kind of...
I think that really started in the theatre, very much with Grease. I'm thinking about the theatre
That was
version.
the 70s, though, wasn't it?
So it was the 70s which started recycling the 50s.
And we'll talk about the Rink as well, which also does it, which is
But the
interesting.
thing is, I think in that respect, it is, Stephen King, of course, wrote It in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And of course, the thing is that he was looking back at his childhood in the 1950s. So, and a lot of audiences who were reading it in those days were also looking back. So you already have the nostalgic looking back there.
The irony is we now have it now looking at the 80s as a nostalgic song.
Exactly.
So in a way, there's always, some would argue, at least about 25, 30 years before people look back at a period and can actually appreciate it.
But Little Shop of Horrors, when Seymour was on the radio, they got a ghetto blaster out. So it was like they were doing a kind of 80s look at the 50s now. I don't know, but...
I think that this production... in terms of period, was all over the place, and it didn't matter. I think it was deliberately
because it's
eclectic.
dreamlike and it's a dumb story anyway.
No, but
if you start questioning the reality of what era you're in, you've got a talking plant. It doesn't really.
Yeah. No, the thing is that what they did get right, and I once again, if I compare this to the bad German production I saw years ago in Gelsenkirchen, what they got right is that Little Shop of Horrors needs to be emotionally sincere at certain moments, because otherwise it just crashes as being just a snooty sort of rip-off of a silly movie to begin with. But if you have something like Somewhere That's Green sung with real emotion, then suddenly you care for the characters, and that is where the whole thing comes together, because otherwise the ending wouldn't have any punch.
And Suddenly Seymour, which is a wonderful song and must be done sincerely.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's no point to the song.
Yeah.
But I think to go back to the point about the size and scale of the production and the overuse of movement of the set, I think we both did see a production at the Menier Chocolate Factory a few years ago, where that, of course, Menier is very small,
but it still went to the West End.
Eventually,
Very small production as well.
But exactly, but when you see it in a small proscenium arch type theatre, there is something charming about the 50s, the sort of takeoff of a B movie, because again those were small scale. And I think there is something, perhaps because of the staging at the open air, and you can't help that because of the open stage at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. This show had to be bigger spatially, and I'm not sure that helped everything.
No, but in interesting ways, the show is so much fun that it doesn't matter. The audience clearly had a blast of a time, and what I liked also about the show is that it shows you a little bit the early days of Menken and Ashman, because there are some lyrics there. Howard Ashman is just absolutely brilliant, but there's some that are a little bit pedestrian, where they're not that original, and you can see how he developed from the great talent that he was to the marvelous lyrics he came up with a little later.
What lyrics do you think are pedestrian and that stand out?
Let me think about it. One of the greatest of all lyrics is, I think Seymour's the greatest, but I'm dating a semi-sadist. That is just absolutely brilliant. I think
there's a very subtle rhyme that he does, and it's probably entirely intentional, knowing Howard Ashman, and it's a washer and a dryer and an ironing machine.
Yes, I think Somewhere That's Green is an absolutely fantastic song. That's really wonderful. I think there are one
Even
or
though
two...
it's exactly the same as Part of Your World.
Yes, I think it's in some of the smaller characters. Also, I think Skid Row. In Skid Row, there are one or two songs where I think they could have been funnier and a little bit more to the point at the beginning when he describes the life in Skid Row. The point is not that he's not good, it's just that some of the lyrics are so brilliant that you realize the odd moments when he isn't quite up to the level that he has reached in certain songs.
I've always thought, you get the impression they probably wanted Skid Row to open the show, because it's a very
traditional
opening number,
yeah.
but it doesn't. You got this weird little, let's put the title of the show in, which still works as a fun song, but it's not a Little Shop of Horrors yet, so I don't know what the point of that song always was meant to be.
I think it's sort of just setting the
Greek
background,
chorus,
but I think also, to some degree, I would argue it might come from the Rocky Horror Show, the
Right.
Rocky Horror Picture Show. Remember, that also starts with a narrator telling us, what had happened and sort of setting the scene.
Because they
And
are
as
a
it
Greek
is in
chorus, aren't they?
Yes, and partly because it's in the same style, making fun of the 1950s science fiction / horror B-movie.
Yes, of course. And to go back to Nick's the earlier point about pastiche, the Rocky Horror Show is 1973, and that, of course, is the big point of where, I think Greece, the stage show is 1972.
Right.
And so those shows were the earliest shows to be doing pastiche of the 50s. One in Greece in a rather careful way, more careful and thoroughgoing. But the Rocky Horror Show, ripping off B movies and sending them up as kind of trash culture, that's a direct antecedent.
So do you think without Rocky Horror Show there would have been no Little Shop of Horrors?
I don't know. I wouldn't go as far as that.
But it's certainly very indebted to it.
It's certainly indebted, and it clearly, as usually with Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, they know what they're referencing. But I think it's more like, I think Tim Rice once said that if you want to start in a business, be clever and write something funny in musical theatre, because it's easier to put on, it's also easier to put off if you have a sense of humour. And so they took a film that cost next to nothing, it looks as if it cost next to nothing, and turned it into a small-scale show with a lot of fun and oomph. And that is a great way into the theatre, and also it's far easier to get a show like this on. It's one of the reasons why it's so often done in smaller theatres, because it doesn't cost a lot and the audience
You just need a massive 8-foot plant.
Yes.
And of course the book and the lyrics are much, much more sophisticated and clever than anything in Rocky Horror Show. As much fun as the Rocky Horror Show is,
Rocky Horror Show makes no
broad.
sense.
It's very broad, yes.
Yeah.
What do we think of Vicky Vox as Audrey 2?
Well, I enjoyed Vicky
Yeah,
Vox
I agree.
as a performance. I'm not sure that having the drag queen moving around the stage outside of the plant helps you very much in believing in the plant itself.
I agree. That was also my reservation, but I think the line readings and the singing were
I liked
wonderful.
it when she was in the audience.
It clearly makes a lot of fun when she's in the audience, and she knows how to get a laugh. So that certainly helps. And as I said, vocally, very, very impressive.
I wonder how much of it was the director and how much of it was her coming up with ideas as this is what my character would do.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a collaboration, because I think in a performance like that, somebody like Vicky Vox is going to introduce ideas that are hers, but the director is going to shape the overall pattern of it. I do understand why they cast a drag queen, because not only does it have in itself, it adds to the fun, but also you are rather stuck on stage, unlike in film, where the plant can be brilliantly animated. In film, you're rather stuck with this mouth that opens and closes in one place in the theatre, and you can't move it around. So to try and create movement in those songs, you have Vicky Vox moving around the stage. However, once you do that, we lose any sense of the make-believe of the plant itself.
Yeah. And I think it's simply also a tradition at the Regent's Open Air Theatre, because you had people moving around and into the woods. They were dancing through the audience and on the town. They had it in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. It's simply a way of getting the audience in. And so it definitely works.
It maximises that shape of that theatre, because once you have a thrust stage and you have people to some extent around the stage, then you need to...
The lighting was astonishing, I will say, in this show.
Yes,
and I wonder, would it be as good in the afternoon
Good point. I can't...
to see it?
I think it
Test
would
that.
lose a lot of atmosphere in the afternoon.
But then, to be honest, and this might also lead us to the Ring, I've noticed that a lot of recent London stage shows are very, very well lit. Even the ones that I didn't really like as much as interpretations. But the Southwark Playhouse had some brilliantly lit productions recently. Pippin was a marvel to look at. Whatever else you might think about the problems of that show.
Extraordinary.
And, the Rink, I also thought was very, very clever.
Let's talk about the Rink. I'd forgotten I saw it, to be honest with you, and not to say that was a bad show. It's just when you see lots of shows, they all kind of do blend into one.
Can I say, first of all, about my response to the Rink, because this is something that I'm working on, and it's very close to my heart, Kendra, very close to my heart. I think that what Adam Lenson did was to rescue...
He's the director.
He's the director. Was to rescue a show that has somehow got lost. Everybody knows the score because it's Liza and Cheetah, and it's the 80s, and it's one of their most famous scores. And of course, Coloured Lights is a very famous
but
song.
But it goes back to the 50s, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. What I think that Adam Lenson has done is to rescue the book. What he did was he has made a very free adaptation of two versions. One, the original book, which doesn't quite work for the premiere production, and another one which I believe was totally rewritten in, I think it was a production in 1990, which is much shorter. It's only about an hour and a half, and cuts an enormous amount of the dialogue. What he's done, I think, and this is to me the real achievement of the production, there are many, many good things about the production, but the real achievement of the production in terms of a piece of directing and dramaturgy is he's fashioned a new book which allows you to see how brilliant that each song is in expressing the theme and story and character at each particular moment. So he's actually shown how brilliant Kander and Ebb are at using a score to forward the story, to tell the story, and to investigate the characters. That seems to me to be the real function of a really good book in musical theatre, that it doesn't draw attention to itself, but that it actually it works in order to allow the songs to tell character, story and theme. And I think he did that brilliantly because he has eliminated lots of repetition and lots of obvious statement in the original dialogue.
So does the musical have two book writers credited then?
It doesn't actually, but I believe, because I spoke to Adam Lenson, that he was allowed, because he had a special contact to Kander. He was allowed by Kander and by Terence McNally to do what he wanted.
Right.
And they are now obviously thrilled because they've seen the reviews, and I think Terence McNally actually saw the production and he said, whatever.
And Terence McNally wrote the
original
book,
book, yes. But they were never satisfied with the original book. One of the things that you know, that is one of the obvious changes, but it's not the only, there are many, many other changes, but one of the obvious changes is to locate Coloured Lights, to shift it from the beginning of the show to the first act, to the end of the first act, so it closes the first act.
It still opened the show though, didn't it? It was still
There's
there.
A little bit
I seem to remember.
They've used underscore,
yeah,
quite a lot. And this is quite deliberate. But what was interesting is, I believe, that the reason that it did end up starting the show, because originally Kander and Ebb and McNally had wanted it to be before the interval, was that you can't. You see, the show was written for Cheetah Rivera, and then Liza Minnelli offered she wanted to be in it.
Was it directed by Hal Prince?
No, it was directed by somebody who's died very young and whose name is not known, called A.J. Antoon. But once Liza Minnelli joined, they decided, well, you can't wait, make the audience wait for Liza Minnelli for about the first 20 minutes. So they introduce Liza Minnelli right at the beginning, and then she actually makes her entrance into the drama a little later. And that was the original reason for in fact, putting Coloured Lights right at the beginning of the show. It's now in the place where dramaturgically they had always wanted it to be.
Although I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think that the show in the Southwark was really, really successful, they made one, I think, very crucial mistake, and that is that they robbed what I think is maybe the greatest song of the show of its impact, and that is All the Children in a Row. The show is very interesting that it combines various pasts, the 1950s, and it's also, interestingly, one of the few musicals I know about the Korean War. There are a lot about the Vietnam War, there are a lot about the Second World War, of course, the First World War, but there's hardly anything about the Korean War, and this is one of them. And of course, it then combines it with the hippie movement of the 1960s, and then it sort of ends up in the 1980s, and the rather sober looking back at both the horrible post-traumatic stress syndrome of the father and also the...
Ironically, it's all coming back to me now.
Yeah, and but I think All the Children in a Row, as originally written, is one of the greatest songs that Cameron Ebb have ever written, and a marvelous summing up of the flower power movement in, 5 minutes, 4.5 minutes, and in sort of conflating the song with the daughter's discovery that her father, actually, that she always was longing for, didn't really care that much about her, sort of robbed the song, for me, of its incredibly powerful impact that it has if it's performed without interruption.
Yes, I think, again, I can explain that in relation to the genesis of the various versions, because in the second version, I think that song was then that it was rewritten, because what they did in the second version was to remove as much of the reference to period and history as they could, which Adam Lenson has restored to some extent, but he didn't restore it by restoring the original song, All the Children in a Row. He left it in the new version. I think what McNally and Kander and Ebb thought was, because people had not responded well to a show in the mid-1980s about the 1970s, I think probably it was too close. You see, usually there's 20 or 25 years before something becomes retro and before you can look at an earlier period with a kind of objectivity and do pastiche. This was too close to the 70s. So it just seemed, why are Kander and Ebb doing some old-fashioned show about the 70s when we're not really interested in the 70s?
I was going to say, is it the first time Kander and Ebb ever did music of the era in which the show opened?
No. Oh! You mean of the 80s?
Yeah.
They weren't doing music of the 80s. They were doing music of the 70s.
Okay.
But it was still too close to the period.
I think that's similar to the film version of Hair, which came out in '79.
Yes.
It was too close to the hippie movement, but not far away. So
Enough.
that people said, "We've just gotten over it. Leave us alone with it."
Exactly, and I think that's what happened with this. And I think they mistakenly thought, when they revised it for 1990, that they should remove as much reference as possible to period.
It was at the Cambridge, wasn't it?
I don't know when the original
Rink,
production in London was.
With Diane Langton and Josephine Blake. It may have been at the Cambridge, I don't remember.
Yeah.
But certainly the original Chicago, the first production in London was at the Cambridge, because I saw that.
Can we talk a little bit about, and I think this is a real achievement, the staging and the way that the Southwark used its comparatively small stage to pull off a show that doesn't need big production values but is very, very powerful if looked at from up close. They had a marvelous cast, not just the two female leads, which of course made the most out of some brilliant songwriting and very, very funny money, especially Caroline O'Connor, who hasn't found a punchline yet that she can't explode. And then you have wonderful Gemma Sutton. One of the things that I think the musical should dispense with is the weird idea that the daughter is overweight. And not
she certainly didn't look overweight to
no,
me.
and it doesn't matter. And it's the same with Liza Minnelli. You know, it's really silly to say, "Oh, you're what is it, a wallflower, and you're looking not your best." And you think, "No, sorry, that just doesn't ring true." And it's not a line that is needed. You know, you can just present them as they are and focus on the relationship with mother and daughter, but also the marvelous male chorus. The way that they sort of brought in the different characters. We're going around the rink was a real showstopper when I saw it, and I think it always is.
I think that was brilliantly choreographed.
Yes.
And I must say again, I think this is a tribute to Adam Lenson, because it was Adam's idea to reduce the chorus. Basically, they are a male chorus. They are a kind of Greek chorus. To reduce them to 6 people who double the roles. Now, that wasn't done in the original production.
Was it a big show originally?
It was bigger than this. It wasn't that big, but it was bigger than this. But they didn't double the people who are the wreckers, who are about to come in and take the building apart.
I think that's a
with
clever-
the characters in the show.
It's
Yeah,
a
I'm
clever
not sure
concept.
about that because you can hear that on the original recording. You need to check that.
No, they are a kind of chorus of wreckers, but there are other actors. Well, if they did double, they changed costume completely, which they don't do in this production.
I
They
think that works.
tried to pretend that they were different actors.
To me, that worked because it seemed it added to the dreamlike
Yeah.
quality of the piece. And when we're hearing the recollections of what happened, like, did it really happen, or is this
Yes.
is this something that someone is just making up?
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's what's so sophisticated about the piece, is that most people at the time, the critics, didn't recognise. They thought, oh, this is a cheesy story about a mother and a daughter, and they're arguing, they're fighting,
Roller skates and
and some roller skates, and
Starlight Express does it better.
No, they didn't think that in New York. They
were
hated
earlier.
Starlight Express.
They were earlier than Starlight.
But I think now we view it through that prism. But I think that the critics didn't get this is really a show about retrieving the past, and it's almost it's continual series of flashbacks, and I think that's what Adam Lenson discovered so beautifully in the production, and he did quite consciously, I think, edit the work so that the flashbacks wouldn't appear as a contrivance or as a special effect, but they were absolutely crucial to the whole show. That we just move from present to past without any break, and the audience.
Do you think audiences have got more intelligent than possibly they were when this show first opened?
They're not more intelligent, it's just that we have new conventions.
Yeah.
And audiences are so used to flashbacks in cinema and flashbacks in theatre and flashbacks in television that this doesn't worry us.
I would also use the word they're more literate in terms of technical, in storytelling terms than narratology. So that's the thing. We are now used to that. And it's similar to, I was reminded this, of course, is also to some degree very similar to Follies. The idea that you have sort of a past that is always present, and the dreamlike atmosphere that you describe, where you're not quite sure, are they living in the past? Are they misremembering the past? Yes. Also, what about nostalgia and past?
And sometimes past and present are coexistent.
Like Merrily We Roll Along.
Yes.
In Follies, in Merrily We Roll Along, that in fact we do live with our memories inside us. Yeah. So the present moment is made up of what I'm experiencing in the material world, and mentally what I'm experiencing, which might be the past.
The whole thing with Merrily originally was that it was only one person's version of what happened, because he's giving the speech at the graduation ceremony.
You can't even be sure whether it's his memories. It's very difficult to judge, partly because I've never seen the original production.
You can't.
Well, there is sort of a bootleg of it, but still, it has been filmed, I think, there are bits of it also in the documentary.
Memory
but still,
purposes.
it's very much, and I think you could argue that it started with Follies, and that the shows from then on were daring enough to sort of take up the theme and do something similar with it. I think it's just interesting that now, both shows that we've discussed are from the 1980s, and they're now sort of, they still work brilliantly, 35 years later, and also one of the other things that it shows how much has changed in London when it comes to casting these shows, where you have, in a small-scale theatre, two performers of the caliber of Caroline O'Connor and Gemma Sutton, who can step into the shoes of Liza Minnelli and Chita Rivera and don't imitate them, but just give different performances, scaled beautifully for the small-scale theatre, for the surrounding audience, and you feel this is a wonderful show that doesn't need endlessly moving scenery.
And I must also...
Could you say the same about Chicago, though?
Chicago is another show that doesn't need endlessly moving scenery and usually doesn't have it. All it needs is...
endlessly moving stunt casting.
Well, if you think about... Well, the show is clever enough in that it survives even the worst of stunt casting because it's about people who shouldn't have any talent.
And because the choreography is so good.
Yes, and of course if you have somebody like
And
Ashley Simpson or, I don't know, whoever else, or David Hasselhoff or whoever else...
Denise Van Outen is
Denise Van Outen is coming back, 3 years for that. In Velma as well, but you have it, and the show protects itself by saying, okay, they can't really do it, but then they shouldn't. It's the inbuilt contradiction. And if you have it in the original cast, two of the greatest dancers ever, Chita Rivera, Gwen Verdon, are supposed to play women who can't dance. And of course, the show pulled it off. And the show also is so brilliantly constructed that it doesn't need a big stage in order to work.
May I go back to the Rink, though, just to say, because we've commented on the two central performances, but the performances of all the male actors I thought were brilliant, because I thought that what becomes a chorus, but they are individualized. Each one plays in a way, in essence, two characters, one in the story from the past and one as one of the men who's going to pull down the building. I won't name them all, but they were absolutely brilliant, both in singing and dancing, and in their acting. And I do want to name Fabian Aloise, the choreographer, because I think the choreography was dramaturgically one of the things that made this work. The choreographer worked obviously very closely with the director to stage the dramaturgy, and it was both funny and great. I mean, almost a standing ovation for the Rink song.
Was that for the performers or was that for the choreographer?
That's for both, because performers without a good choreographer can't make a dance work.
No, that's true. That's definitely true. And it's nice to see that now there is in London a whole bunch of very good choreographers and very good directors who can examine those little-known shows and come up with something really fresh.
And male dancers who can do it, because when I started going to the theatre in this country, pre-Cats, you couldn't...
Wow!
You couldn't find.
BC, as we call it.
BC. You couldn't find a car. There were very few. Let's put it this way: dancers, male dancers, good enough to do what these people did in this show.
You go to Broadway a lot, and do you think the quality is still better in New York than it is here?
No, I think the quality is exactly the same. I think what is better is the quality of directors we have here, to be honest. And there are some brilliant choreographers on Broadway, and there are also some brilliant choreographers here. And the cast is usually just the same.
Usually I would say the dancing might have a slight edge on Broadway, but I think the music, the scores, the songs are better acted in London, usually. And the overall values of the production generally on the West End stage tend to focus on the dramaturgy, on the drama. In New York, on Broadway, I think there is a rather alarming tendency, and I've noticed it in the last 10 years particularly, towards allowing virtuosity to dominate, and the actors seem often determined to make an effect at all costs. For example, there's far too much overacted comic playing recently on Broadway that I've seen, which undermines the integrity of the whole show. I'm not against comic acting. We have brilliant comic actors in this country. Look at Imelda Staunton as a comic actress. But that they don't do it at the expense of the show. And I think in New York, you do see that occasionally.
What I miss in New York, and I think this is a different understanding of the functioning and the idea behind revivals, is that a lot of the revivals in New York tend to be copies of the original with some new line readings thrown in. A good example of a show that doesn't question anything is the revival of The King and I playing at the Palladium. It's brilliantly sung and performed. It's an enormous amount of fun, but it doesn't question anything about the show. It gives you the same, to some degree, even the same costumes you had in the movie with Yul Brynner and Deborah Carr. You can always get away with an evening if the lead is sung by Kelly O'Hara, who is just a sensation. But on the other hand, the production doesn't investigate the material. The production doesn't have a look at it. Where are we now? 60 years after it opened. It takes everything for granted. It should be, because theatre exists in time.
It's not meant to, but what it does is it therefore has the feeling of archaeology. What we see is...
it's the same with West Side Story, isn't it? You're not allowed to tamper with
They
it.
will do it now on Broadway. There will be a new production directed by Ivo van Hove with a Belgian choreographer for the first time being allowed to change the choreography.
But that's not because directors haven't wanted to change it. It's because the estate wouldn't allow it.
Yeah.
And I think the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate is equally constricting. But I think that on Broadway, part of the problem is that Bartlett Sher, who has directed so many now of the Rodgers and Hammerstein canon in New York, keeps saying these shows are universal and they work in spite of or through across different periods, and that isn't true because our attitude towards
The King and I is incredibly
racist,
tricky nowadays.
Well, it's racist and it's sexist in today's terms.
And it also is, it's not, one of the things you notice if you watch this Rodgers and Hammerstein show for the first time is that, yes, they seem to be integrated, but God, the integration is creaky. The way that they introduced I Whistle a Happy Tune, it's just, oh, come on. It's the same also with...
I'll tell you what I do when I'm feeling nervous. I whistle. Whenever I feel afraid. That's...
But it's the same. It does the same in The Sound of Music with
exactly.
Raindrops and Roses.
That is even worse when it comes to historical inauthenticity.
Your
let me
lovely
tell you.
schnitzel and noodles and all that.
Yes,
kind of stuff.
but it's also.
But these are pieces from a different time.
Of
if
course.
you just go in accepting that, you can say, "Oh, we have come very far." Nowadays, look how weird they were.
It's not about looking down and saying, oh my God, how have we evolved? It's just having a look and saying, what does it mean to us now? If you have a look at this and then saying, okay, that doesn't mean you have to throw out the production. It doesn't mean that you have to sort of cut and paste and
Can I give you an example?
It's just about making it relevant for us and saying, God, it might be written 55 years ago, but it still means a lot to us, apart from the gorgeous melodies.
I think I can give you some examples of the difference between British directors' approach and American Broadway directors' approach. And I think it partly comes from where the British directors have come from. The British directors, in the case of Rodgers and Hammerstein, have come from subsidised theatre. These are very sophisticated people who are used to dealing with very old material, for example, Shakespeare, and making a very old play, for example, Hamlet, relevant to audiences today, not by changing it, but by taking a different look at it. So if you look at the landmark production that the National did, of Carousel first, of Nicholas Hytner's Carousel, which succeeded both in London and on Broadway, there were a number of very small... He didn't change the thing radically, but what he did is he got a great ballet choreographer, Kenneth Macmillan, the last piece of work he worked on, and he died while working on the choreography, but he got Macmillan to choreograph the show, rather than try to copy the Agnes de Mille dances from the 40s. And he cast a less macho, smaller, more insecure Billy Bigelow, actor as Billy Bigelow, and that changed the emphasis. He also cast Clive Rowe, a very unusual piece of casting in those days, especially in the early 90s, a black actor as Mr. Snow, and that got you to both laugh at, because it was in a way out of keeping with the period, but it got you to question who Mr. Snow is, which is interesting. So we had a different take on the show, which seemed to incorporate ideas from the contemporary period. I think another example was Trevor Nunn's brilliant Oklahoma, which I think was even more successful, because I think what Nunn somehow managed to do, without changing the show at all, he investigated the psychology of every single character so that you really believed in the gender and sexuality discourse that's going on in that show, so that you really saw Aunt Ella is a woman used to living on her own, and she's strong. Laurie is actually a tomboy because she's used to working the farm herself with the assistance of her farmhands. So all the arguments and the fights between Curly and Laurie and Judd and Laurie are all about a young woman who in some ways is performing a masculine role in the farm, but also wants to be a heterosexual woman and is inexperienced sexually. So all those, and Ado Annie wasn't just played as a comic soubrette, she was played as a very sex-obsessed young woman who was prepared to be promiscuous. So that began to allow the show to breathe and to make a real point psychologically. And I think that did change. And of course, what Nunn did after that, it didn't succeed totally, but at least you could see where he was going with Rodgers and Hammerstein. When he did South Pacific at the National, he surrounded the representation of the war in Southeast Asia, the Second World War, he actually gave you historical footage, historical documentary footage, to show you that this really is a war. It's not just a bunch of butch gay men dressed up as sailors prancing around singing "There Is Nothing Like a Dane." And I
That's
think
a shame.
I think this didn't totally work, but it was the first step at investigating what that show is really about.
Yeah, well, what it showed up was that the show doesn't work if you try to make it realistic, because South Pacific isn't. But of course, with Oklahoma, you can also pinpoint that is the moment when that show, that production by Trevor Nunn arrived on Broadway, where the American critics start turning against it and saying, why do they have to investigate those shows? Put them on as they were, because they work perfectly. And I think this is a very, very different understanding of musical theatre and musical theatre works. In New York, it's very often that the critics said, this is timeless. You do it as it is and as it was done since 60, 70 years ago, because the show is universal. And this, I think, is a very bizarre understanding of theatre, because especially popular theatre, because it always reacts to what is happening outside the theatre. And so the same way that Rodgers and Hammerstein wouldn't write the shows they did in 1941 or 43 or 43, 45 and after, today, it also means that the productions that were so famous wouldn't be the same now. One of the things that is very bizarre about the King and I revival is that they keep all those endless reprises that are meant to cover scene changes. Nowadays, we don't need that. We don't need a traveling curtain or anything, because the sets can change within seconds. And so a lot of those endless reprises, which honestly don't add anything to the storytelling, just make the evening even longer than it is, just could be cut. Why keep them? They're dramaturgically unnecessary. They were there for a production-wise reason. They had nothing to do with the story.
As we're talking about King and I must say that I have seen it recently, and I must say, in spite of our caveats about the director's interpretation, there are some wonderful performances, and one of them, of course, is, as you expect, is Kelly O'Hara as Anna. But the other one that is that is superb is Lady Tian. And the woman playing Lady Tian gives a Ruth Ann Wilson,
I think so.
Gives a wonderfully moving performance and sings it beautifully, and does get you to the heart of what Rodgers and Hammerstein can do.
Is she the Mother Abbess character?
Yes.
Yeah, that one.
And she sings something wonderful, which is the "You'll Never Walk Alone" anthem in
Climb
show.
every mountain walking alone.
Exactly.
Or,
This song, I think, is better than those others, and she sings it. She acts it beautifully as a singer. And I actually also liked, surprisingly, though he is sometimes difficult to follow, the Japanese actor Ken Watanabe. Who gives an extraordinary performance. It's very distancing in a way, because it's almost as though he were using some kabuki theatre techniques. But I think he's very witty in the role, and I think what he's actually doing is showing you how foreign that person would have seemed to Anna and her son. And in a way, the piece is written from Anna's point of view. So it seems to me legitimate to show that. Not just to laugh at the king, because he's intelligent, and that is clear in the performance. But he's very foreign.
Does it do value to the Palladium spectacle demands?
Not really.
Oh.
It's sort of stretched out, and I think, but it's still not quite as disastrous as the production at the Royal Albert Hall a couple of years ago, where you just felt that Anna was standing in another building to the king. And you think, what you realize looking at this is actually a two-hander. It's usually 2 or 3 characters on stage. And yeah, exactly. But nonetheless, because they give you lots of very, very elaborate costumes, and because it is a show that actually benefits from having a huge audience, I wouldn't mind seeing it. I didn't mind seeing it at the Palladium, but it doesn't need that enormous stage.
I want to go back to what you were saying, Olaf, about the brave interpretations that we do here compared to New York.
Some of them are brave. Not
do
all
you
of them.
think the company that's opening soon at the time of recording would they have done that on Broadway first?
Well, I think if Marianne Elliott, for whatever reason, had decided to do it in New York, Stephen Sondheim would certainly have said yes.
Is it ultimately up to him, or is it up to the rights holders?
I think it's up to the writers to allow that certain changes are made. And he was even willing, you might have heard that they tried a gay company a couple of years ago with all the roles being played by men, and Robert being gay, and he decided that didn't work. And obviously what Mary Elliott and Rosalie Craig did was they sort of presented him with a reading and said, look, it makes perfect sense to have a 35-year-old female in the lead. And he said, actually, it does. So I think what you also have here is you have the willingness of a great artist to try things out. I'm not quite sure that you would have Andrew Lloyd Webber being that willing to allow you to, I don't know...
cats in drag, although that probably would be
not
rather
cats,
fun.
but I don't know.
A female phantom or something.
Female phantom, yeah. Whatever you can think of, partly because he is very, very, and we know that, very, but he's also very insists on having the shows presented in a way that he thinks best. And for him, there is only one way of doing this, or hardly more than one. Whereas Sondheim is very open to whatever. And, sometimes it does work, sometimes it doesn't.
I think Sondheim...
But sometimes shows aren't brands.
No.
Whereas Phantom and
they are. Even though, of
etc.
course, you could, if in those days, for instance, the original production of Sweeney Todd is legendary, the original production of Company is legendary, the original production of Pacific Overtures is a marvel, if you can have a look at it. And you just think, Follies, come on. But you think if those had been, filmed, if they had been distributed that way, they might have been brands as well. But still, you just think, well, we're always talking about brand reinvestment and brand rediscovery, that, even the Phantom or Cats could be rebranded if necessary.
But I think that Sondheim wants to find the best way to do his shows. I think sometimes there's a difference between saying this show is now Frozen.
It's been confused with Frozen, which is on Broadway.
Exactly. This show is now Frozen because this is the best, this is the brand, and this is the best production that there could ever be. Sondheim knows that no production is the best production that could ever be, and he's therefore very interested, I think.
Well, he said himself, musicals aren't written, they're only rewritten.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why he was so, I think, impressed by Imelda Staunton as Mrs. Lovett in Sweeney Todd at Chichester, because he saw that she reinvented the role. Not that Angela Lansbury wasn't brilliant in the original production, but this was a different interpretation, and it worked.
And the same with Madame Rose.
Same with Madame Rose.
But just have a look at the different reactions of the press to, and in Britain and in America, to The Last Evita. That Argentinian lady, God, I've forgotten her name now, who played the lead in the revival. Elena Rogers, who played the lead in the Michael Grandage revival. Here in London, she was praised. In New York, they just said, why did they praise her? She doesn't sing like Patti LuPone. Well, she didn't. She didn't have that particular take on it. I didn't like the Michael Grandage production, which I think didn't work. But the thing is that in New York, and it's partly because of the enormous wide distribution of the cast recordings, of people knowing and having seen Patti LuPone and having that voice in her ear, there's always a thing, it has to be just like that in order to, she has to be belt just as well or even better in order to be a worthy replacement. And
it's the whole Ellen Green thing, isn't it?
Yes, it's the Ellen Green thing. And
the number of people who have copied Elaine Stritch doing Company, playing that role in Company, that is not the only way to do the role. It's brilliant. Elaine Stritch was brilliant.
It's a way to do the role.
And it's happened to be the first. But if we were all still playing Hamlet the way Burbage played it in 1603, it would be a very rum old
It'd be a very long evening as well. Probably.
Yes,
definitely.
But I think this is a very interesting topic, because I think that obviously Sondheim has been very, very encouraging to the investigation of his works in performance, partly because he's always felt that shows didn't always work in their first performances. So famously with Merrily We Roll Along, he has revised and revised and revised it. And every production is a kind of revision in a sense, and I think he understands that. And especially if a show becomes a classic, classics are always reinvented. Molière, Shakespeare, Ancient Greek Tragedy. These are shows that exist still after...
Classic and Paul.
Well, the Ancient Greek Tragedy exists after 2,600 years, precisely because it is being reinvented in every
Little
new
Shop of
production.
Horrors.
Yeah.
Little Shop of Horrors. And that's why, all credit to them for having Vicky Vox in the production, because in a sense it gave it a freshness for a contemporary audience. And if it's just done the way it always was done, or the way it was originally intended to be done, these shows are going to die.
It'll be interesting, and I hate to say this, but sorry listeners, it will happen. When Sondheim dies, who's going to take... His husband's quite young, isn't he? So...
I didn't know he was married.
Sorry, his partner is quite young.
I think what he will do is he will always allow things to be investigated in a certain way. He once stepped in when they did certain things to some of his productions that he didn't like, and famously there was a production, I think it was with Elaine Page of Sweeney Todd, the English National Opera, where he just very quietly said, please don't do this ever again. But he will allow people to do this, and I think to change the production, or at least to investigate things. So we'll have to see. I think the problem is partly because the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization are incredibly difficult. Everybody knows that, and they're also very conservative and also they're interested in protecting the brand of Rodgers and Hammerstein.
The national production of Oklahoma, they added a ragtime dance into Everything's Up to Date in Kansas City, and they had to fight for the bitter end to do that.
In those days, it was also that the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization said, if it flops in London, nobody will ever know about this. This is before social media. This is before the internet. Of course, nowadays, whatever you do, even if you do it in Sao Paulo, it might somehow find its way back to those people.
The Rodgers and Hammerstein Foundation, probably because of the success of Oklahoma, did allow Trevor Nunn to change a few things in South Pacific. But then they went back. Then it seems they went back to their more conservative point of view for the Bartlett Sher production.
Bartlett Sher was also allowed to take the material and tinker with it, but of course he didn't tinker a lot with it because he thought it's perfect the way it is, and it isn't. Especially not South Pacific, which is very problematic in many respects.
I've heard also the Royal Dull Estate are now a lot more controlling over musical
I'm quite sure they are. The minute people realise that there is money to be made, you need to be careful. And I think they would also argue that the disastrous Charlie and the Chocolate Factory just pointed out to them that not everything will turn into a Matilda that actually respects the material and gets the best out of it.
Speaking of, do we know anything more about the witches that the National has meant? Because it's completely fallen off the...
I knew nothing about it.
No, I know nothing about it. And
it was meant to be at Christmas this year, so
it's not going to be.
No. I think it might just be one of those things that they tried and then realised either they still need to work on it or it doesn't work at all.
Be like this podcast. Thank you very much, Olaf and Robert, for joining us for this very interesting, varied episode of Musical Talk, and we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
For more information about Musical Talk, please visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk. You can email us at feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk, listen to past episodes on iTunes and YouTube, and follow our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.